This video is a recording of a panel from Story Crafting Sessions Science Fiction, a free virtual conference hosted by the Weeknight Writers Group in partnership with Renaissance Press. To learn more about the Weeknight Writers Group, go to businessforauthors.com/weeknight-writers. And to learn more about Renaissance Press, you can go to pressesrenaissancepress.ca.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Civilization and Conquest, Echoes of Colonialism in Science Fiction. And that is our panel topic for today. This event is sponsored by Renaissance Press, Canadian publisher dedicated to publishing, supporting, and uplifting marginalized authors. Thanks to them, we have live captions for this panel. You can find a link to Renaissance in the chat. I would also like to acknowledge that this event is being organized and held on traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of First Nations peoples. And we will start with introducing our panelists. So when you introduce yourself, please give us your name, your pronouns, and tell us a little bit about why you wanted to speak on this panel. Does anyone want to go first?
Oh, heck, I'll go.
All right, go ahead.
I'm Joyce Reynolds Ward. I'm speaking to you from the Nimi country held by the Nimi Poo, also known as the Walama or the Walawa, Nez Perce, as those of us who are not Nimi Poo would call it. My pronouns are she, her, and my writing tends to explore themes of high stakes family and political content, conflict, physical and digital sentience, personal agency and control, realistic strong women, and whenever possible, horses. I have a bachelor's degree in political science and a few years of experience in organizing Democratic Party politics. This panel, one of the things I wrestle with is that I am a descendant of settlers. My people came to Oregon in 1846, and I don't have strong origin ties other than that because I'm a settler descendant of poor dirt farmers. We don't keep track of our heritage. One of the things I have done as acknowledging that I'm a descendant of settlers is that I have analyzed and examined my settler history and the responsibilities that come from it. Poor dirt farmers are still complicit in what was done. But some considerations we need to have is how many of the agents of oppression are themselves from oppressed peoples, because that's tend to be what those in power tend to do, is pit oppressed peoples against each other.
That's true.
And how much of conquest is the relocation of other oppressed peoples?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Themes I deal with in my work. It's one way or another.
Thanks. Jonathan, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, I'm Jonathan Navarre. My pronouns are he, him, and I write science fiction, particularly space opera. I also write short fiction and flash. I am a longtime academic, new to the fiction writing world, and very happy about that. In my other life, I'm an art historian. I'm an educator, and I teach at a small art and design college in Philadelphia, Moore College of Art and Design. And my space operas really are focused for the most part on discourses of power and issues of ethics, particularly around social, cultural, and especially ecological aspects of territories. And I'm also very interested in war. Many of my characters are veterans who have lived through war and deal with the consequences of war, both psychologically, but also politically and culturally. And so there's expectations around post-war nationalism and patriotism that informs their decisions. And I write character-driven space opera. I'm a very close writer in that way, although I write in large, expansive, secondary galactic worlds. And I was very interested in this panel for a couple of reasons. One, I'm really interested in, as I said, really looking at power. And I'm very interested in material philosophy. I look a lot at cultural conditions and the way in which ideology is such a powerful force and tool, and how ideology relates to power and excuses for actions, and how people are able to negotiate systems with strong ideologies. So
All very important topics that very relevant
yeah,
today.
yeah, exactly.
Unfortunately. Next panelist. Let's go next.
I'll go. I'm EK Barnes. My pronouns are she, her. I write a blend of urban fantasy and science fiction. And my debut, When the Divine Are Dead, came out in 2020, and its sequel, In the Case for Fate, was released in 2021. My books, especially the first book, really focus on generational trauma resulting from white supremacy and Nazism in World War II, and its continued existence into present day America. How that's kind of impacted and still impacts current generations, which is kind of what brought me to this panel.
Wonderful, thank you. And our last panelist, Brandon.
All right, my name is Brandon Morehouse. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm actually a fairly new author. I published last year, so my debut, New Age Gods Discovery, is set to be a 9-book series on. Wow. Yeah, it's a big one.
Ambitious.
Yeah, the whole thing revolves around demigods in current times fighting for equality and equal rights. So that's what really brought me into this panel. I wanted to see what would be those natural events that would happen if that were going on. So that's what brought me in.
Wonderful. I'm gonna have to check out your books later. Sounds very interesting. Okay, so for the questions, we're gonna go in the same order we introduced ourselves, and so you'll get a chance to answer each question. I'm just gonna read them out. The first one is, so the definition of civilization in English language science fiction, especially, is strongly influenced by Western colonialization efforts. Fiction writers have to borrow from a framework of general knowledge, our day-to-day existence and historical time periods. The time period that we tend to most emulate when we try to capture that joy of discovery and exploration moment is, in historical hindsight, tarnished by what we now know about theft, abuse, genocide, and exploitation that was experienced by the peoples that were attempted to be colonized. In your writing, how do you navigate who or what civilized looks like for your characters, your worlds, and your cultures, particularly in the context of conquest, conflict, politics? How do you define civilized in your work, and how do your characters react to this? Joyce, start us off.
Okay, well, for one thing, I tend to operate from the point of view that everyone is civilized. It's just potentially expressed in different forms. Mm-hmm. In my work, the uncivilized are, I don't call them that, but they are often the powerful who choose to exploit others. Mm-hmm. For example, in my Goddess's Honor world, the uncivilized are definitely the emperors of Duran, who are tearing down their own empire while doing gross emperor things. In my science fiction, you have Philip Martiniere, who is the descendant of French royalty and fancies himself as the modern day successor to the Medicis and the Borgias, who are ancestors. And so you get into that. But for me, civilization is cooperation, not conquest. And so that I tend to kind of subvert the conquest theme by having outgroups from the conquerors turn around and ally with the conquered so that they are subverting the conquest theme. And I mean, there's my other series, the Network Sequence, which is this one here, The Life in the Shadows. Indigenous peoples have taken advantage of the civil disorder in the United States to reclaim lands and sovereignty. That is actually, it's a collection of novellas and short stories, and that process drives one whole segment of Life in the Shadows, a segment called Shadow Harvest, where it's basically you see an unnamed tribe, the Nimipu, but I'm trying to be discreet, step right in and say, okay, here, we'll help you. We're buying your land and we're taking our land back. And that's part of the foundation of that world, is that the tribes are coming back, which is somewhat reflective of real life. What's
That's
happening?
yeah. Jonathan.
Sure, yeah. And that's really interesting, Joyce, because I do something similar in a secondary world. And I'm fascinated. It's going to be interesting, I think, for me to hear, because all of my works are written in an entirely secondary world. And I purposefully divorce myself from even any historical trajectory that leads back to anything, let's say, Earth-based. Because I wanted to have a separation to work from. But I really was moved by an essay I read by Ursula Le Guin. It's an introduction in her Left-Handed Darkness essay book. And it really, I think, spoke to me about the fact that even though you might write in a secondary world or entirely divorced from what seems like our reality, you're of course addressing issues that are crossing the two. And for me, I think I came to this through my art historical background. There's a lot of contemporary artists who I came to know who critique and respond to longstanding colonialist narratives through performance art especially. And these are both artists who are dealing either with representation or the European imaginary, and critiquing, different ways in which colonial representation has become entrenched in either explicit or implicit biases. And I really used that starting point, I think, in the series to make sure that cultural relativism was always at the forefront of the character experiences, that whenever possible, I really wanted to make sure that neither myself as an author, but also even the characters either weren't imposing one particular single master narrative onto the entire world, or if they were being called out on it as a part of a process of pushing back. And the way that I did this in the Windtide series in the first book, Goodbye to the Sun, was I used a rather kind of maybe an unorthodox POV structure, which I kind of gleaned from Greek tragedy. Every chapter toggles between first person POV and third person limited. And there's two characters. Every chapter goes back and forth. It's almost like a chorus intervening in the Greek tragedy model. But Razor, who is the POV first person character, it's actually not only first person, it's also epistolary. It's actually a kind of a diaristic reflection 60 years after events. But then the other chapter is live unfolding of the time that Razor is reflecting on through the other character, Keen Drayden. And so you kind of get these two versions, which for me was really important, because one of the ways I wanted to fight this idea against really a perspective of this idea of an in-group and an out-group was to really amp up the subjectivity of shared experience. So you actually get two characters experiencing the same things together, but yet the way in which the experience affects them and the way in which they literally live through those events are different based on the relativism of their particular conditions. And so
plus you've got the added perspective of the epistolary part and the
exactly, yeah,
and the POV. You almost expanded your perspective 3 times that way.
Yeah, and I wanted that distance there too, because I liked the idea of the character having, and it's about 60 years hence, so you get this great reflective kind of wisdom that comes over time as well, to look back on events versus reacting in the moment of the events. And she has the benefit, in a way, of knowing what's happened and even processing the consequences in the way that she's representing the events and her role in them. And there's a lot of ways in which accountability, which is such an important word for me, and I don't know if it's even in the dictionary anymore these days. I feel like accountability has somehow been erased from the dictionary, is really, really also very important, that, that comes into play as well. So yeah, so, everyone in every character really goes through transformations, but they're always self-directed. I think it's very important too that characters, don't come to some form of self-actualization through, benefit from another, that there's always that kind of self-determination built into them. And that's really important. And the last thing I'll just say briefly is I also really like to focus on the micro level with vocabulary. And I think that, obviously being sensitive to vocabulary is very important. But even something as simple as, I don't use the word jungle as a descriptive term to describe a particular, ecology. I use rainforest. And it's not necessarily that, that has to be the case in a secondary world, but I don't want to make a connection.
You're cultivating a particular atmosphere with that. Yeah,
you are. And I don't want to even, let's say, start a string of connotations back to certain ideas about jungle that has very colonialist legacies and representation, especially in science fiction and in pulp science fiction, especially. Those are some ideas in some ways in which I approach that.
Thank you. Ike.
So in my writing, civilization is pretty close to, modern day Midwestern America. So there's not like a lot of extra creativity there. I think, the major conflict comes from and between groups of people who walk around like everyday people, villains are doctors, churchgoers, scientists, lawyers. I wrote YA, so sometimes other students, the heroes are students and their parents and elders who work in a variety of different, jobs in education, law enforcement, broadcasting, real estate. And they're just, everyday people going through a life. However, the villains specifically are stuck on the idea that, the heroes are fakers, more or less, that they're just kind of going through the emotions, pretending to be people when they're not, which isn't true, but because of, stereotypes, they see the heroes as very different from the rest of them, and in a way, uncivilized. And, the villain's definition of civilized, is you live in the same house with a white picket fence for 20 plus years, work a 9-to-5 job, or married and have a heteronormative family of 4, and are preferably in a white skin. And whereas, the diviners are a diverse group of people in all shapes and sizes and skin colors, and some live in houses, some are nomadic, some are, variation where they're moving from one house or apartment to another every few years, typically out of survival because, the villains are constantly, chasing them out of their homes. So, they have some will seem very different and some will seem very similar, and they're just, it's a diverse, example of, different types of definitions of civilization.
And how even though cultures can define them differently, like those people still can look exactly the same.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, yeah.
Brandon, anything to add on this question?
Yeah, I think, and I got to be careful here because I can't give too much away for my next book that's coming out, right? I've only done one. So,
of course.
I think with my writing, I look to anime, right? So you do a lot of internal dialogue. So you get that in my writing. So you see that character's point of view and why they think they're so much better or more civilized than this other person. I tend to think back to, and this is like, tell me your age without telling me your age. I think of Pocahontas in the early 90s when she's talking to John Smith and she's like, the only people that you think are civilized are people like you. And that's not the case. It's different perspectives and why they think so and why not, and so on and so forth. I think that's a big thing in my writing. So a lot of that internal dialogue is really why they think that.
So becoming more open-minded, opening up perspectives, and
Yeah.
And definitions. I like that. All right. So our next question is, concept of civilization is often linked to cultural, especially religious values. Cultural and religious traditions can apply moral guidelines for right and wrong actions and kind of form the base of a culture's idea of right and wrong, crime, justice, punishment, on both an individual level and up to a national level. So in your writing, what cultural, religious, or other factors do you use to set up value conflicts in your work? And how do your characters navigate a world where that it can affect their level of privilege, it can affect the opportunities they can take advantage of, or their ability to demand justice or avoid injustice? And back to Joyce.
Well, I tend to like to write those people in power who are either subverting structures or someone who is not in power for various reasons, who is suddenly elevated by discovering they're not who they thought they were, or affiliation through marriage. And I mean, that's the whole conceit of the Goddesses Honor series, is you have this random traveling healer. She's a circuit healer. She owes a lot of, she is in serious debt because her mother took on the gods and is now being cared for in a place that there's no way that you will ever see her go back. I mean, Katirin is not going to go back there, but she'll send money to to make sure that everybody's incentivized to keep mother alive, because that's what you do. And then she suddenly discovers that, well, there's maybe a little bit more to your background than you realize. And she ends up, over the course of a couple of books, not only being a healer to leaders, but becoming a leader herself. And her daughter ends up becoming the empress. Well, the daughter, again, is in the next set of books is going to be busily involved in looking at the structure of empire, going, this thing is a mess. Let's just throw it out. But you can't just there's a reciprocal. I think when I'm writing people in power, I try to emphasize that there is a reciprocal duty, that if you are in power, you have responsibilities to those that you are working with. I also tend to go with the self-sacrificing billionaire with a vision who isn't Elon Musk, but somebody that's actually semi-decent.
Helpful.
My Gabriel Martiniere character, for example, he does not like what he sees. This is in a near future. It's an alternate near future because it's too close to our current day to say this is where we're going to be. But it's in a world where indentured servitude happens when you get into too much debt these days. You get too much credit card debt, you get too much, you end up in indenture. Well,
I mean, that happens today.
yeah, it's not formalized, but this is formalized, where and et cetera, et cetera. It's a metaphor. But he discovers that the family company, most specifically the man he thinks is his uncle, is doing mind control, forced mind control on indentured workers. And as a result, he ends up testifying. He gets into the inside. He ends up testifying against it in the federal criminal case and pays a price for 30 years of exile from his family. He marries someone. He is forced into divorce by the man he thinks is his uncle. And so there's a certain element of that. And that tends to carry across the stuff I write.
Yeah. All right, Jonathan, do you want to speak to that question? And then once we finish this question, we'll take a look at audience questions and come back to these ones because there's been so much here. We're going a bit long.
Great, sure, yeah. I'll make sure I keep it short. So each of the 3 books in the Windtide series are inspired by ancient Greek texts. And what I wanted to do was work on some of the themes in there. So the first one is inspired by Antigone. And there's a struggle there of the theme between family and state. I chose Antigone for a lot of reasons, but one of the main struggles there is the theme of family versus state. And that leads into a cycle in the second book, Jade's Wager, where you end up with a series of events that are an almost call and response. And it's based on myths around the Trojan War, but you're looking at extreme forms of vengeance and retribution. And through that, you lead to the Eumenides, one of a series, a trio of plays by Aeschylus that really brings forth a new judicial system and concept in society. And so the entire series is about working your way through a shifting set of values through personal and collective conflict. And what happens is really it's that middle book, Jade's Wager, where an individual is introduced who represents a kind of forward-thinking attitude that Jade is really a figure ahead of their time. And it makes them a little bit of a martyr, and in many cases misunderstood, because their way of looking at the world and what they want the world to be like, or how they think the world should be, the world isn't ready for it yet. And it's really the responsibility of the person that they're mentoring to experience enough through their own individual problems and conflicts. They come from a lot of lack of privilege in certain ways, but also have, I think, a series, again, the ideology, have a series of assumptions about the larger, broader world that is out there that they confront, that really makes them have to grapple with a lot of difficult questions and produce a personal ethics. And that leads in the third book, without giving too much away, really to a realization of a new judicial philosophy that really offers a view and an approach that takes us forward. So I would just say there's a little bit of hope punk sort of sprinkled, like, fairy dust on the top of my space opera series, especially the third book. And even though it really is at times a heavily conflicted and even what we might consider to be sort of, grim, dark, tragic series of events, that by the end of it, through this catastrophic shift, there is really a kind of a direction forward that really shows the potential for what a civilized, unified collective could look like that functions with impartial justice.
I think that's really relevant to today. Our justice system definitely needs a bit of an overhaul, a lot of an overhaul. And it's interesting to consider some of the places that we might go with that in the future. EK, do you want to speak to value conflicts in your books?
I always think this is an interesting question because it's not necessarily my heroes' values that lead to any type of oppression or lesser privilege. It's the level of oppression they face is kind of due to the values of the villains. Because it's the villains who have the power and whose, values feed what they do with that power. And a lot of that has to do with, cultural or value differences. Both sides hold themselves, at least in their mind, to a moral standard, where they have a system of belief that, tells them what's right and wrong, what is considered criminal. And they both have some kind of justice and punishment system that comes with that. And I think the biggest thing they have in common, is their sense of community. Both sides feel responsible for their respective communities. But the major difference is kind of how they show that responsibility. Several characters on both sides, see their main goal for the community as needing to stay pure or needing to be perfect or clean or, safe from outside involvement. They're more focused on making sure, nobody comes in and threatens that. However, I think what separates the heroes from the villains, at least in my books, is that, the heroes also have this very strong sense of helping each other so that they can all move forward together as one big unit or family, as opposed to the villains who often, will leave their community or their family behind to seek those dangers out, which, clearly is a cultural difference. And
That
another
kind of
thing,
speaks to what Joyce was saying before, how civilization kind of can be defined by how people are or are not working together and bringing everybody forward.
yeah. Yeah, and another thing is speaking on like just privilege. Yeah, my main character, he's the narrator of the story. He has a type of privilege that perhaps gives him and his friends and family the advantage of being able to be the heroes in their scenario, and to demand justice, because my MC, he's white and his dad is white, and because of that they were able to kind of enjoy certain privileges that maybe some of the other diviners didn't, or had to work harder to get. And so they moved to this relatively nice neighborhood right on the edge of Indianapolis, and it's almost in the suburbs. And they came here to flee from not only a family tragedy but also religious, spiritual, and cultural conflicts in their previous town. And this is where the series begins. It starts out with, oh, we have the privilege of being able to uproot and possibly rebuild our lives. But they soon figure out that that's not actually as easy as they think it is, because despite being visibly white, they are also diviners, and people know that. So, yeah.
Excellent. But it's always interesting, especially to look at the interplay between an established civilization and what they consider justice, and how people can operate through that system, and whether people see that as fair or unfair. Brandon, any thoughts on that?
I think with my series, it's set in modern times, and I use a lot of social media and news stations, referencing those of how those influence all of our thinking. So that's what I rely heavily, sometimes a little bit more subtly on those. And it's kind of hard because mine takes place in like a military compound. So there's not a lot of exposure. So it's very, very militaristic, right? So, but you've got this extreme group of demigods. There's an extremist group that has infiltrated into the military, and I look towards current day extremist groups on what they would do in these sort of situations. So I look to a lot of current day. How can I make this relevant to someone that's reading it in current times? So I think that says a lot, and I think we underplay any news station, right? Because especially a 24-hour news station, whatever station that may be, on how what they air and what they choose to say, and using those perfect words that either just get us going. We're like, oh, where it's the same story, but just how they word it and how they present and how long they present it too on there can make a big difference on how we interpret it. I think that's where
we're even seeing with some of the news reports recently, like what you're allowed to use, what word you're allowed to use to talk about conflicts, can get you in trouble.
Yeah, and I think go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I just think that's if I lost my train of thought. So yes,
All good. Okay, so we did have one question which kind of ties into what I've listed as question 4. So we're going to do that one. The question from the audience is, aside from the breakthrough in guerrilla warfare tactics used in the Revolutionary War, have there been any other military advancements that have changed the face of military writing in fiction, and how does that impact the societies we see in science fiction? And that kind of ties into how do countries decide, or individuals decide within countries, who gets treated civilly, what are the sovereign rights of an individual or nation, and how are you allowed to approach that question when some of their actions might threaten the safety or existence of another individual or nation.
I'm not really.
Does anyone want to start with that one? Joyce, sorry.
No, I really can't speak to the military side of things except very generally. I mean, my perspective is definitely not military. I lack the background and training to address military, and I don't write military. That's because I don't have
Fair
that
enough.
I don't have that background. I will make the point, however, that I was going to do for question 4, which was that when you look in detail at the conquest of North America, besides disease, what really starts jumping out, especially with the Western peoples, is that a slowing of settler advance by 20 to 40 years would have drastically changed things because
have.
peoples were very, very skillful technology adapters. And that would have made a huge difference. And that's kind of what I was doing with my fantasy series, only with magic. That's all I got.
Cool. Does anyone want to speak more to the military side of things? Maybe Jonathan?
No.
No?
So I write, I write space opera, which I think partly immediately defers to space battles. And so therefore there's this connotation with, a militaristic storyline. And I do have war veterans in my book, but I also am not by any means an expert on military tactics and strategies. But I will say that I am very interested in the appropriation of military strategies and tactics by revolutionary resistance groups. And so I'm very interested in incorporating that into the stories as I can. One of the things that I'm very drawn to are earlier avant-garde groups like the Situationist International, for example, and even more recent people writing, like I'm thinking of Michel Desserteau writes about this a little bit, the practical uses of everyday life, the way in which we turn productions by a dominant group back against them by using them in ways that they didn't intend them. And so I'm thinking about the ways in which recent revolutionary movements have utilized social media and very quick communication devices to counter surveillance. So there's ways in which
disinformation.
Yeah, exactly. And so that to me is really, really an area where I think guerrilla tactics is used in an interesting way. And I try to think about always telling narratives. I'm interested in telling narratives from the point of view of resistance as much as possible. And so you learn about, I think, hegemony, oppression, colonial imperial domination through the lens of resistance. But no, I won't speak to the military thing either, because I also have no.
I'm just going to throw something in riffing here off of Jonathan. One of our examples that we have right now are the Ukrainian farmers. Now, what a lot of
tractors, right?
Tractors, but
and the changing of signs.
Yeah,
you take off a lot of the military equipment, and you have a perfectly good piece of farm equipment. I mean, if you look around at ranches and farms post World War II, and you will see the repurposing of a lot of military equipment for farming.
EK, did you have any thoughts on that?
No, I really don't, just because I don't typically write specifically on war. I just more
that's fair enough, but you can also you can also talk about whatever you had for question 4 about deciding the sovereign rights of an individual or nation when they impact another one and how we view that.
Yeah, I don't know. Hold on.
Do you want me to ask the question again?
I have auditory processing. I gotta read it, so I'm like reading it real quick.
That's fine.
Yeah, I did not have a good answer for this one, so I
We can go on to Brandon and come back to you if you want.
Yeah.
All right, Brandon.
Jade, can you read that back to me? That question again?
Sure. That question is, conflict is a practical example of what can happen when two different nations or cultures have different definitions of what is civilized or who deserves civility. And so your characters will be impacted not just by how they feel personally about how they would react to someone's actions towards them, but how their country is going to react to other countries' actions against them.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is that question 4? I thought
Yes.
I was referring to the question from someone in the audience.
I kind of added it on because they were both about conflict. But if you want to say something specific about the military, please go ahead.
I'll talk specifically about the military part because I think
all right.
I did serve in the military briefly, and I do write military. So I think the biggest advancement that we see is probably like the drones. It's distant warfare, right? So we don't have to send a number of troops directly into the battlefield when we can have them at a distance. Now, I'm going to take that a step further. I think it would be interesting for a story that, or whatever, right, to see, because it's going to come down to, at some point, I think, what's cost effective. Is it more cost effective for us to send a soldier in as a human being and fight this war, or having a drone that could be destroyed that cost this nation $1.9 billion? I don't know if that's the real number. That's a random number, but I think at some point that's going to be a real conflict. And I think,
I mean, it already is, because you're already evaluating the life of a person versus the cost of a drone.
Yeah. I think that would be an interesting, if someone dove into that really deep. I would say drones are probably the biggest advancement that would change the military.
I'm just going to add a point in here. I recently read Sharon J. Zhao's book. I can't remember the title now, and it's completely escaped me. But part of that was sort of the characters were becoming weapons that they would drive around like mechs and things. Iron Widow. Thank you, Lisa. Yes. But yes, so that was almost like a merging of a person with the machinery, and then those people, it was negotiating their rights. Were they people? Were they machinery? Were they weapons? Are they allowed to have feelings? How much of their life gets to be controlled by the state because of their weapon status? That also kind of bleeds into some of the superhero genre side of science fiction as well.
Could I jump in for 2 seconds? Is that okay?
Of course.
Yeah, I just wanted
Absolutely.
to respond to Brandon because it was really interesting. One of the things that I'm really interested in, sort of the example I think you used relates to it a little bit, is this difference between the consequentialist ethics versus the moral imperative, and the way in which, like, you go into a situation already having determined your position and you're not going to budge, versus looking at what the outcome potentially might be and making that choice. And my characters in the world actually end up in those situations a lot. And both sides are flawed as well as they are promising. And it's just interesting. You were making me think of that when you were talking about determining the value and assigning value based on what the meaning of value is. Is it economics? Is it humanitarian? Is it, right? It was just interesting, I thought.
Yeah, well, that's kind of the heart of what I want to get to with civilization. Like, how are we valuing people? How are we valuing technology? And sort of like, where do the basis for those values come from? And like being more thoughtful about that in writing. Okay, I'm going to check see if we have any more audience questions. I don't see anything at the moment, but we are getting close to the end of our time. Let's go around one more time and talk about the question I skipped over. So, science fiction is an ideal place to reimagine history or re-engineer the future. In your work, how do you use the genre to examine history as it could have been or imagine what could be possible in the future. And sorry, saw another chat bubble. Okay, we'll start with that question though. Joyce, do you want to go ahead?
Well, I kind of touched on it in my last answer, which is, for me, at least in my fantasy, the might have been that drives is what would have happened. How could settlement history, especially in my little corner of the Pacific Northwest, have happened differently? Because there were turning points. There were things that could have gone differently. The chief factor of the Hudson's Bay Company, John McLaughlin, went to the fur trappers in early settlement Oregon in the 1830s and said, hey, what do you think? Let's just say goodbye to the Brits, goodbye to the US, form our own country. Given McLaughlin's, the fact that McLaughlin was married to a Métis woman, that they had a record of good collaboration with the native peoples, it would have been a much better deal for the native peoples. The role of disease. There's a lot of little things. Just if Isaac Stevens had not decided that he was going to negotiate treaties with every blooming nation in the Pacific Northwest and institute very repressive treaties, we are still dealing with the heritage of what Isaac Stevens did in 1855. All of that could have been different.
Yes. Jonathan.
Okay. I also have I can respond to the question, it looks like, from Jake as well. I have a relevant part of that too. But I'll wait and do that when we come back around. Look, this is why
you can do them together. It's okay.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, this is why I love writing speculative fiction. For the very possibility of having that open space to imagine. And, I come from a background of academic writing where, it is art-based, so there is some subjectivity and interpretation allowed for the viewer in there, but really it's an evidence-based methodology. So like, as an art historian, you're always having to point to evidence and find it. And if you can't, you got to throw out what you're writing. And so being in a world of speculation where everything is really an open table for me is really just a wonderful and liberating place to be as a writer. And so, yeah, I definitely look a lot at language. I actually incorporate there's multilinguistics in my world building. Language has etymological roots, which is very important to me. I'm very interested in etymology as well. I'm also interested in thinking critically about communication and about how I can perhaps create versions of communication that are more equitable and are beyond even verbal in various ways. So that's really important to me. I could go on and on. I'm very influenced by biomimicry, and I try to riff off of some biomimicry and look at the way in which the environment in a natural biological ecosystem kind of works, and think about maybe ways that design principle could be integrated to enhance or maybe improve on existing world building. So there's a lot there. But with regard to Jake's question about illness and injury and equitable medicine, I just wanted to say that was really interesting, because in book 2, Jody's Wager, at the beginning, the MC gets hurt and is treated and has a critical conversation with a medical individual who tells the character Ilo that they treat anyone, and they treat people from both sides of the conflict, and that they talk about a medical creed, which is fairly straightforward, but it leads to a larger conversation about equity and access, especially to medical needs. And it works to kind of move certain rights, humanitarian rights, outside of the particular conditions of a moment in time and place. And it brings a kind of an opening of a philosophical really coarse for that character. That, I just wanted to say, comes back, spoiler alert, towards the end of the third book, where when, you know, the conflict is entirely resolved, that becomes enacted in practice as really the first gesture of a new attitude of collective unity. So, you know, it's a really interesting question, and I just wanted to throw that out there. Thanks.
Thanks. Ike.
Okay, so
What are you using sci-fi to imagine or reinvent?
okay, so I reference a lot of like real historical events. So, but I add a kind of a science fiction element to that, where, you know, I twist those events a little bit and I add things that
Extras.
just kind of extra things in there that not necessarily part of history. Yeah, so yeah, I make a lot of references to, you know, World War II, for example, and so there's a narrative where there's certain things where I talk about like, oh, these happened at the camps, which did in a way, but I also heighten them and I make them, you know, I have some fiction that I add in there as well. And that's what's affecting, you know, the current population is what happened here, what happened there.
Well,
But
what you're doing might be less about like making a new future than maybe bringing,
it's
you
bringing
know,
kind
the
of reality.
recent future, like connecting to us better.
Yeah. It's not really like I'm imagining a different future. It's it kind of
That's
feels
still
almost
important
dystopian,
though.
but yeah.
Brandon, and then we are on our 10-minute warning. So we did have a few extra audience questions, but we may have to carry those over to the discussion in the Discord. So Brandon, do you want to speak to the last question? And then I think we'll just have time to go around and tell everybody where they can find you online.
Yeah.
So, Brandon?
I think it might kind of helps answer Jake's question also. I saw that pop through.
Sure.
In mine, a lot of what's happening is what helps set the tone is like demigods have been discovered through genetics. So people with that genetic, they call it an abnormality, right? They're genetically tested before they're even hired for a job. So if they have a condition.
Predisposition, yes.
Thank you. I don't know why I'm stumbling over my words. Then they're not hired. So then if none of the demigods can get jobs, then they're kind of really struggling to get by. And that leads to conflict and, well, we're just trying to get through, and then the cops are after them and so on and so forth. So it just has this revolving door. But I think it's hard because it's a military setting, and military people get, they have free healthcare. So I think we as sci-fi authors, we write what we want the future to be like, right? So if we want this to happen in 100 or 50 years or however, write it now, and then that will happen, because people will read your book like, oh, that's a really good idea, and so on and so forth. So, but I think the genetic testing, we're starting to kind of see that now. You have to do that for like heart conditions, or
that's gonna be a whole new level of discrimination.
That's a whole new level of discrimination that we're just barely into right now. And it's there, you might not get hired, or you might not get insurance because something that you literally
and then there's also like the issue of medical privacy too. Like, how can you be discriminated against for something that's technically a medical record and should be protected under privacy? Like, that's a whole issue as well.
But then they go into, it's like with mine, it's public health, right? Because if you have these abilities and you have no control over them, right? You're just coming into them and say you can control fire, and you get upset and you cause an explosion. You're threatening lives of other people. I know that's very very genetic, but I think that's where it kind of toes the line just a little bit, where it's like it is my private right to know if I'm a demigod or whatever. I have these conditions, or at that point, does it become in my book anyways, is it a public health or public safety issue?
Yeah, like what level of discrimination do you choose? Anyways, we've got about 5 minutes left, so we're gonna quickly go around and everyone tell us where to find you online and where your books are sold. And then we will continue further discussion in the Discord. So if you have more questions or questions we didn't have time to get to and you still want to talk to our panelists, you can find them in the Discord after the panel. So once more around, starting with Joyce, where are you online and where can we find your books?
You can find, I'm going to be putting my links over in the Discord. There's a panelist links. You can find me on Twitter at Joyce Reynolds W1. That's probably the best place to engage because I'm kind of restrictive on my Facebook because Facebook is a pain.
Fair enough. Yeah.
I also will be posting links to my Amazon Central page and my series links over there. I have a new release, which is actually a re-release of my Network Sequence series. And so I'll see you all over in the Discord.
Thank you, Joyce. And Jonathan.
Yep. So the Windtide series just re-released last week in a new edition with new covers. Yay, it was very exciting.
Yeah, very pretty.
So so you can find, I'll put a link in the chat too, to my website. That will take you everywhere. On the bottom of the web first page, you'll find my socials and whatnot. But the Windtide series out now. I just started audio production yesterday on the first book in the series, and auditions are going to be coming in. So I'm super excited, to hear that, which should be really fun.
That's great.
So they're available at the usual places through the website. And then I have a standalone space opera coming out in November called Stellar Instinct, which is it's a sort of a mashup. So it's an espionage space opera, which should be interesting. So that's me.
Definitely gonna have to talk to you later. EK, where can we find you online?
You can find me on Twitter mainly. I'm most active there at Elisa for a Change. It's ELLISA for a change. And then I'm EK Barnes Author on Facebook, EK Barnes _author on Instagram and TikTok, although I have not updated TikTok since October. So my website is ekbarnesauthor.com. And you can get my books there. You can get them on Amazon. Pretty much anywhere that sells books online has them. So bookshop.org, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million. So.
Thanks. And Brandon.
You can find me on Twitter. It's at Brandon Morehouse. I don't know how I got lucky with that one. Literally nobody else in the world apparently has that name.
Wow. We're lucky.
Yeah. And then
that's an OG account, man.
I was shocked. Considering I just joined a couple of years ago, I was like, whoa, I'll take it, right?
Even more shocking.
And then you can find my books on Amazon.
This video is a recording of a panel from Storycrafting Sessions Science Fiction, a free virtual conference hosted by the Weeknight Writers Group in partnership with Renaissance Press. To learn more about the Weeknight Writers Group, go to businessforauthors.com/weeknight-writers. And to learn more about Renaissance Press, you can go to pressesrenaissancepress.ca.